Hello all, welcome back to my CCSP exam review, and today we're going to cover Domain 6, which is called as a legal risk and compliance. My name is Prab Nair. For more information, you can refer my LinkedIn profile. So let's start the first part of this domain. So the first part is basically called as articulates the legal requirement and unique risk within the cloud environment. See, one of the important thing we need to understand that, okay, if the customer is based out in one country and the provider is based out in other countries. So in the case of any kind of a legal issues or any kind of a security breach, who will be responsible? Who will be accountable? Definitely it is driven by the contract, and contract here it is act like a third party governance. So this is one of the important part of a CCSP exam preparation. It is my suggestion, those who are not from the GRC background, those who are not from the cloud background, or they never worked on the cloud operation, it is my suggestion to them, spend good amount of time in Domain 5 and Domain 6, especially Domain 6. So whenever I used to refer my candidates who are preparing for this exam, I used to give more attention to this particular domain. Okay. So the first part, as I said, articulate the legal requirement. Suppose I'm a customer and I'm basically taking the services from the provider. So when I'm taking the services from the provider is based out in US and customer is based out in India. So in the case of security breach, who is responsible, who is accountable, and what kind of legal disputes will be there, according to what investigation, according to what regulatory parameters we have to handle this particular case. So all those things need to be addressed in the initial stage. So contract is the driving factor for any kind of a governance when you deal with the cloud provider. Remember that while preparing for the exam, while practicing the questions, okay, and during the exam also, because if contract is basically ineffective, it can directly or indirectly impacts your cloud relations. So the first part here is called as a conflicting international legislation. So we have a different kind of regulations, we have a different kind of legal parameters. So how to deal with that, what are the conflicts we have, that we need to understand. See, when you basically move your data on a cloud, okay, when you basically move your data on the cloud, we don't have a visibility about the physical location of the data because data is logical. So globally, there are numerous laws, regulations, and other legal requirements for the organization we have, by which they have to protect the security and privacy of the digital data. And if you fail to protect the digital data or fail to protect the data, there are some legal penalties we have. So all kind of challenges we need to understand, conflicts we need to understand from the exam point of view. That is why they have mentioned here, it's called as a conflicting international legislation. The second part, what we have is evaluating the legal risk specific to the cloud environment. See, adherence to a one legal requirement within a specific geographical region in the world is easy to manage, where the organization originate may not cover the stringent or conflicting legal requirement with another geographical region in the world. That basically become the risk. I'm operating my services in India, so I know what are the regulations we have, right? If I'm operating my services in India, okay, I know what are the regulations I need to follow. But I am right now in India dealing with the US, what kind of a treaties we have, that is always a challenge. So before shortlisting any kind of a cloud provider or before onboarding any kind of a cloud services, we need to evaluate the legal risk specific to the cloud computing. And what are those legal risks? This is addressed in the book and it is quite testable. Third is basically called as a legal frameworks and guideline. So organization provide a global services that need to be familiar with the legal frameworks and guidelines that are operated where they do the business. So as a cloud security consultant, if you're working for the cloud provider, it is very important for you to have a good understanding of the different regulations. And from the exam point of view, I would recommend you to follow Canada PIPDA. Then HIPAA is there of US, which is a regulatory privacy requirement, but it is more like a industry privacy regulation. Then CCPA is there. Then the COPPA is there, COPA, and then GDPR is there. OECD framework is there. So you need to have a high level understanding about these frameworks while preparing for this exam. So OECD, APEC, GDPR, all are basically quite testable in the exam. Make sure while you're preparing, do not skip this particular topic. Another important topic which is basically quite testable in the exam is called as a EDiscovery. EDiscovery, which is called as an electronic discovery reference model. It is always a challenging aspect for a cloud customer to do the investigation in the cloud environment, depending upon what kind of a service model and deployment model you have. If you have a SaaS solution, you have a limited access. If you have a IaaS, you have a more access. So forensic science is generally defined as the application of a science to the law. So digital forensics, also known as a computer and network forensics in many definition. But there are some variety of data sources we have in the cloud. Doing the investigation in the cloud, that make difficult challenge. So electronic discovery is the new concept we have in CCSP, which is all about preserving the information. Okay, preserving the information. Then we have a collection. Then we have a processing. Then we have a review. Then we have analysis or production. So we are mostly deal with the ESI, electronically stored information. So EDRM is one of the framework we have that we basically use to collect the data in a digital ecosystem. In the cloud, we have to follow the EDRM process only. Another important process we have is ISO 27050. ISO 27050, yes, you need to understand from the exam point of view. It basically has a 3 parts: overview, guideline, and code of practice. Okay, another important thing that you need to understand from the exam point of view is called as a chain of custody. So chain of custody is also testable in the exam. And chain of evidence. Chain of custody is basically all about who basically obtained the evidence, how you basically obtain the evidence. So it basically used for the evidence handling. Okay, it is basically used for the evidence handling. So chain of custody and chain of evidence. Sorry, chain of custody and chain of evidence. So chain of custody is all about track the evidence handling, and chain of evidence is all about the sequence in which we have obtained the evidence. Sorry for the handwriting. Now example like Prab collected the evidence. Prab hand over the evidence to Rajesh. Rajesh hand over the evidence to Shailesh. Shailesh has hand over the evidence to Shima. So what is the timestamp in which they hand over and what was the hash value? That need to be submitted in the chain of custody as a document. And when you submit the evidence in the court, you have to submit the chain of custody along with that. But chain of evidence is all about the sequence in which we have obtained the evidence. So it is basically mapped with the timestamp. Example, from the system A, I obtained the evidence at 8:20. From system B, we have obtained the evidence at 9:40. So this is how we have recreating an entire event if we have a timestamp. So chain of custody and chain of evidence, you need to have a good understanding in the domain 6. You also need to understand the 5 rules of evidence. Okay, you need to have a understanding of a 5 rule of evidence, which is covered in the domain 6. Another important thing is basically called as a privacy issues. See, compliance with the relevant privacy and data protection law represent both for the customer and service provider. So it is essential factor for a success of any cloud computing service implementation. Therefore, it is essential that cloud service customer and cloud service provider should work jointly to find some kind of a solution by implementing an appropriate agreement. That is why, as I said, any kind of a legal issues, conflicting issues are there, it can be resolved by the contract. It is completely depending upon, as a cloud security consultant, when you're shortlisting a cloud provider with the effective due diligence process. So you have to follow the proper due diligence before onboarding any kind of a cloud provider and vendor. You also need to understand the different between the contractual and regulatory issues that we have here. You can see, just give me a second. You need to have a good understanding of the difference between the contractual and regulated privacy data. Example, if you fail to provide data protection as per GDPR, then GDPR enforces a penalty. So that is called as a regulated private data. We had a deal with the vendor that if any kind of a security breach will be there, this kind of penalty we have. So here the data has been processed as per the contract. So contractual and regulated data may coexist within a single complementary context And contract may be formulated to enforce the adherence to the regulation or set of regulations which may define the need of a contractual relationship between the provider and consumer. Another important thing, so as I said here, we also need to understand the jurisdictions difference in data privacy, because jurisdictional variance become the evident during a cases involving the cross-border data request or a case of contentions. So we need to understand the international privacy regulations or international jurisdictions before processing the data. Another important thing that you need to understand from the exam point of view is called as a standard privacy requirement. So ISO 27018, it is a first international code of practice that focus on the protection of personal data in the cloud. Okay, so that is there. It basically has a five key principles. I think five key principles they have. Okay, which is called control, transparency, communications, or independent audits. So cloud service provider used to adopt this ISO 27018 2009 to maintain the appropriate privacy control while they're processing the data. Another important thing, we have a gap which is called as a generally accepted privacy principle. So the AICPA and CICA have developed, so AICPA and CICA have developed the tool, process and guidance based on the gap to assist the organization in strengthening their privacy policies, procedures and practice. Another important, we have a GDPR, Europe-based privacy regulation. For more information about GDPR, I have created a dedicated video for that, which is called as a CCSP data privacy video. Another important thing, we need to understand the PLA. Very, very important, which is called as a privacy level agreement. PLA with PIA is quite testable in the exam. Privacy impact assessment, which is all about the level of privacy that you maintain, and to ensure the appropriate privacy you will maintain in the cloud environment from the provider point of view, we basically get it signed the PLA. So Cloud Security Alliance has documents that provide the baseline for complying with the various frameworks and legislative mandates concerning the data privacy. So PLA provide the basis for the communication between the service provider and consumer, where the documentation exists related to the how the provider protect the data. So with clear and concise communication, the proper level of protection is understood and known, and compliance with the legislative requirement is maintained. Any kind of pitfalls we have, that will be captured in the PLA. It is like same like SLA, we have the level of service that we document and expect it. Same level of things we are talking about in the PLA. So ultimate role is, this document is providing a baseline how to comply with the legal and regulatory requirement. So that is basically there. Another section which is basically called as understand the audit process, methodologies and required adaptation for the cloud environment. See, after completing this particular module, you will be able to understand the different drivers for the internal external audit we need to understand from the cloud point of view, and how to assess which audit program is appropriate for a specific business compliance reason. See, journey to a cloud-based computing required the significant investment, throughout the organization. So with the emphasis on the business components such as finance, legal, compliance, technology, risk strategy, and executive sponsors, this is always a pain point. So the large number of stakeholders always looking for the provider who should be trustworthy and all that. So you need to have a good understanding of audit and how to drive audit in the cloud environment. So first part here we have called internal and external audit. So you need to have a good understanding of internal and external audit controls. Actually, we have a three type of audit: first party, second party, and third party. First party is basically your internal audit. Second party is basically when you do the audit of a supplier, and the third audit is basically called as a regulatory and ISO audits. So understanding of internal and external audit control is very important for you to understand. Why are we doing an audit? The question is that, see, by this we can able to provide the effectiveness. It gives the assurance to the board and risk management team on the organization of a cloud or a risk exposure. If business practice are helping the business manage the risk and meet the strategic objectives, so all those things can be addressable through an audit. The summary is audit provide the visibility about the program effectiveness, assurance to the board appropriate controls are in place, and business able to manage the risk. Okay. But impact of the audit requirement, that is basically the second part we have. Impact of the audit requirement. So impact of the audit requirement is the second thing. So need to understand how to audit the cloud environment. So we use one framework called as a CCM. Again, it is from the CSA, which is called as a cloud control matrix. It is my recommendation suggestion to everyone who preparing for this exam need to have a good understanding of a CCM and CAIQ. CAIQ stand for Conscious Assessment Initiative Questionnaire. It is again from a CSA, which is used to initiate the process of identifying the areas of focus for the cloud audit requirement. Another important thing is called as a SOC report. 100% very important for the exam. You need to understand the utilization of a SOC 1, SOC 2 and SOC 3. Usage of SOC 1 financial control, ITGC. SOC 3 is basically high level report that we published in a website. SOC 1, SOC 2 have a type 1, type 2. Utilization of a type 1, type 2 is quite testable in the exam. Do we have any kind of a restrictions while preparing for the audit scope and statement? That is also quite testable in the exam, because audit scope restrictions are typically used and enforced to intelligently focus toward the weak areas, or you can say effort toward the area that are audit ready, or restrict the relevant component function for an audit review. The next part is basically called as a audit planning. Audit planning basically has several steps where we define the audit objective, audit scope, audit process, field work, analysis, gap analysis stage, reporting, all those things are there. So you need to have a good understanding of the CSS star also. We have a three stars, level 1, level 2, level 3, which is called as a Cloud Security Alliance. Okay. Along with that, how to deal with the policies, providers and functions, that is also quite testable in the exam. Policies, procedures and all that. Okay. Then identifications and the involvement of relevant stakeholders, and according to that preparing a plan, that is also quite testable in the exam. Specialized compliance requirement for the highly regulated industries. Here you need to understand some kind of a functions like, just give me a second. Here you need to understand the perspective of data center. Cloud is operate through a data center. So there are some regulated industries we have. According to that, we need to comply with data center. So we have this NERC. I don't know whether you guys heard about NERC. NERC basically stand for North American Electric Reliability Corporation. It is basically used for critical infrastructure protection. So they are committed to protect the bulk power system against a cybersecurity component that could lead to a misoperation or intap. So CIPC was formed to help the NERC and advance the physical security and cybersecurity for the critical electrical infrastructure for North America. Another important thing is called as the impact of distributed information technology. Cloud is all about distribution. So there is a constant change and fluctuation in the jurisdictional landscape for the data located in a multiple geographic location. So ISO 27018 suggests the cautions when engaging in processing of the controlling data across border. So where a specific contractual agreements apply to the international transfer of data, such as model contract clauses, binding corporate rules, or cross-privacy borders or cross-border privacy rules. So the agreements and the countries or circumstances in which such agreement applies should be identified. So that is basically another important thing that you need to understand from the exam point of view. Next thing is basically called as a understand the implication of a cloud to enterprise risk. So after this particular module, you will be able to understand the difference between the liability and responsibility of a data controller and data processor. We can able to understand the regulated reporting requirements that are associated with the data breaches, identify the risk management frameworks that are aligned with the business compliance need, and we also going to assess the need for a quantitative and qualitative analysis and corresponding risk treatment. Those who have did the CSSP and going for the CCSP, this particular module will be a bit easier task for him. So in this section, we're going to discuss about the risk management program that we have here. Risk management program. risk management program that is quite testable, where we're talking about identify the risk, analyze the risk, and treatment of the risk, where we have a 4 option: accept, mitigate, transfer, and avoid. Ultimate goal of a risk management is to reduce the risk to acceptable level, reduce as much as possible a residual risk, and then we start monitoring that. You need to have a good understanding of a data owner versus data custodian. It is quite a US term, a data controller and data processor, which is quite used in Europe. I want to give you one small example of a controller and processor. Okay, so we have a data subject here. I went to bank to open an account. Bank basically using a cloud application. So here the data subject is me. Bank is basically a data controller, and cloud is basically process the data on behalf of bank is called as the data processor. So one thing you need to remember, by end of the day, bank is the one, or data controller is the one who faces the regulation. Any kind of a security breach, or in the case of penalty cost and all that, he transfer that particular risk to the cloud provider with the help of effective contract. Okay, and the cloud provider will basically pay as per the compensation amount. So you need to have a good understanding of the data controller, data processor, and data owner and data custodian. Another important thing that is testable in the exam is, so what is data subject actually? One person has raised a concern. So one who can identify directly or indirectly by the reference to their physical, psychological, mental, economic culture is basically called as a data subject. One more thing is called as a data steward. Data steward is responsible for the data content, context, and associated business rule. And data custodian refer for the person who maintain the safe custody, transport, and storage of the data. And data owner is the one who hold the legal rights and complete control over the data elements. So risk profile, risk appetite, responsibilities, who will does that? That is also quite testable in the exam. Along with that, we also have a regulatory transparency requirement. Different regulatory authority want their customer to be notified. Like GDPR, they say 72 hours. Then we have a SOX has a different requirement. GLBA basically has a different requirement. OECD basically has a different requirement. PIPDA basically has a different requirement. So GDPR, you need to remember that is called 72 hours, and you can refer GLB and SOX from the CBK. Once the risk has been identified, we have a 4 choice. Either you can avoid this exam, you can basically modify, you might change the dates, you can take insurance for this exam, or you can basically accept the risk. We also need to understand a different type of risk framework. See, before going to discuss about risk framework, it is very important for you to understand what risk management program we have from a provider point of view, okay? And how you can basically use a risk management program for the program effectiveness. So risk management program will indicate a consumer what risk is being shared with the provider, what risk the consumer must manage on their own, difference between who is responsible for certain action and who is legally liable for the outcome. Example, GDPR, you are accountable for everything, but what you did, you have offset the risk to the provider. So that is why it is very important to have a good understanding of a risk management and the cloud specific risk. Another important thing which is quite testable in the exam is the different risk framework. That is also quite testable in the exam. So risk frameworks are useful for the organization that require the clear roadmap to manage the risk. We have a ISO risk management framework, which is called 27005 and 31000. NIST also had 837. Once you basically identify the risk, you need to do the proactively monitoring. So we have a 2 type of metrics here, qualitative and quantitative. You need to have a good understanding of the quantitative risk analysis, where you have a ALE, we have a SLE, we have exposure factor. Don't worry, for the calculation on the left side in the exam, you will get a calculator. You just click on that link and you can able to do the calculation. Another important thing that is very quite testable in the exam is called as a assessment of a risk environment in the cloud. Okay, so you need to have a high level understanding of the common criteria. Those who have did the CCSP, in that CCSP we used to cover common criteria. Okay, common criteria is basically has a 4 component. One is called as a protection profile. One is basically called as a target of evaluation that we need to test. Then we have a security target. And last is basically called as a EAL. evaluation assurance level. So EL basically have a level 1 to 7. Now tomorrow, if I basically build my product and I want international acceptance, I will basically send my product for the common criteria lab testing, ISO 150438, I believe. I'm sorry, I just missed that. I will just check and get back to you. So common criteria is basically there we have that we can use. So I can basically send my product for the testing. Okay. And this basically has an international acceptance. So common criteria used to test the application also. Okay. It is basically used to test the hardware also. And it is basically used to test the services also. Okay. So common criteria is quite testable in the exam, especially those who are basically preparing for this. ISO 15408. Yeah, I'm sorry. ISO 15408. Yeah. So protection profile is the expectation of the common criteria lab. Target of evaluation is a product that you need to test. Submit the document, which is called as a security target. And then we basically assign EL1 to EL7. So this is how you basically assess the cloud provider. The next section is basically called as a understand the outsourcing and cloud contract design. Now, cloud essential characteristics directly affect the boundary and make it more dynamic and fluid. So on-demand self-service blurs the line between who is responsible for the management of a specific processes and control, the customer or provider. So whenever you basically outsource your services to the third parties, or you're dealing with the cloud provider. So actually the cloud provider is the one going to host your entire infrastructure solutions and everything, depending upon what kind of a service and deployment model you will go for it. So there are some governance practices we have that we need to follow when you basically deal with the outsourcing functions and everything. So first part is basically need to understand the business requirement. So understanding the importance of the service level agreement we have and PLA we have. Okay. Understanding the importance of service level agreement and associate documentation and agreement is essential to efficiently define the business driven cloud consumption. So SLAs are designed by the perspective of the cloud service provider. We also have a service level requirement, which is basically shared by the customer to the provider. Provider will basically agree and share the draft SLA, and as per the SLA, we basically drive all the services. Make sure as per the SLA provider is providing a service, we have a service level report also. So service level report, which basically ensure what we agreed and what is basically delivered. Another important thing is basically called as a statement of work. That is also quite testable in the exam. Then we have a master service agreement too. Vendor management, like example, you dealing with the SaaS with the Amazon. So you are running a company. You're dealing with the SaaS for Amazon. You're dealing with the Microsoft for the IaaS, and you're dealing with the Salesforce for the SaaS solution. So here we need a dedicated team, a vendor management team to deal with the vendors. So whenever you basically onboard any vendor, the first we need a VMP. What is VMP? Vendor management policy. It is important to understand the capability and policy of your supporting vendors. What are their modes of communication in the case of emergency? So emergency communication path should be established and tested with all the vendors. When to done that is covered in the book. Another important thing, when you're drafting a contract, it is an important part of a CCSP team. Contract management is basically one of the mostly important part of the CCSP. Very, very important. Okay. So contract management is a key and a fundamental business activity which is amplified by the significant outsourcing of our roles and responsibility. So it required the educate governance to be effective and relevant. So role of a cloud governance and contract management should not be underestimated or overlooked. Required that due to ongoing monitoring of the requirement, contract performance, adherence to the contract terms, all those things need to be considered when you deal with the contract management. So small hint I can give you here, understand the contractual requirement will form your baseline, understand the gaps which basically allow you to challenge the request, and organization will have a good idea of the kind of a leverage they have during an audit. Okay, so that is why right to audit, matrix, termination, litigation, cyber risk insurance, everything you can basically define in the contract. That shows your effective due care and due diligence. If cloud provider is outsourcing some of the function third party, then we have a supply chain management. So there is a one standard we have which is called as ISO 27036. 27036, which is basically called as a security techniques. So information security for supplier relationship. Okay, make sure you should review this. So they have one part 4 which talk about the guideline for a security of a cloud services. Okay, so gaining a visibility, okay, responding to a risk specific to the acquisition, provisioning of cloud services, all those things are covered in the 27036. Okay. When looking at the supply chain risk, business continuity and disaster recovery mindset should also need to be considered. So this is all in this particular domain, and it is my last and important advice for everyone. Domain 1, domain 5 and domain 6. Do not overlook. Don't overestimate the importance of the domain 1, domain 5 and domain 6. So it is my suggestion. What are the points I have covered? Please review that, and my best wishes for your exam preparation. Thank you.